I would like to start this day with Reverend Juraitis, who was mentioned yesterday, some thoughts about the light. And he writes an article where mentions a prisoner who spent 20 years in the prison, and he says, it was a gift to have 2 hours when light was turned off because of some damage. Before and after 20 years, he had only light turned on. And it was the best gift for Christmas. So our session is about light that we can turn on our shadowed Soviet occupation period when our university was closed, and what is the result of that period today we will be talking about. And I'll give...
Good morning. As I was already presented, my name is Ilona STRUMICKIENŽ. I'm a historian, but I probably won't be speaking as historian here today. As my colleague Daiva mentioned, I was thinking about the light. I don't know who of us come with that nice romantic title for this session, but really the thinking about university idea, about knowledge, about education as a light bringer in the darkness is really, I don't know, nice, and it gives, I don't know, a lot of thoughts and empowers us. Actually, we have presenters who are mostly from the western side of the hemisphere, and when I think about that light, an image of Adela Dirsytė, blessed Adela Dirsytė, comes to me. She was also a graduate, an alumni of Vytautas Magnus University, and reading her, I don't know, memoirs about her, there is witnesses who are saying that she was telling in that exile for little groups of girls. She was telling what she was taught here at the university. So. And we have a lot of examples of people in prisons, in Gulag, in exile, who were these light bringers. And Vytautas Magnus University, Lithuanian University existed, normally existed. It gave a lot to development for people who were studying here like a person, because it was about education, it was about a social status, what was about knowledge. What is interesting, of course, a romantic relationship started here. A lot of families later turned out of these relationship, and I think we have some examples of these. Yeah, and I'm thinking about Adolfas and Jadvyga Damušiai, people who used to meet here in the buildings of Vytautas Magnus University. So there are a lot of nice things, and in 1940 this changed. The brutal occupation of by Soviet Union changed everything. And these people, they carried that light which they used to which they got here at Vytautas Magnus University through exile, through emigration, through different generations. And I hope we will be able to discuss and to show, and I don't know, I hope this will be, I don't know, example for us, inspiration for future generation, for people who are studying here now, who are working here, that we should be concerned about that light and thinking about how to give it to other people. Because yesterday when I was thinking about what is university in our days, I opened internet and looked the quotes. You know, in English there are a lot of such things as quotes about certain things, whatever you want. So I put quotes about university, and it was interesting that most of them, they were not very positive. and like university is a campus or around the library, but for people we are talking today, it was much more. So let's talk about that more. And the floor goes to Skirma Kondratienė, who is representing Dr. Mykolas DRUNGA, who couldn't be here with us today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I do want to remind you as I read this that it is Mykolas DRUNGA speaking, not me. Vytautas Magnus University is not the oldest university in Lithuania. That distinction belongs to the University of Vilnius. But our university, VMU, is unique in several respects worth thinking about as we are celebrating 100 years, a full century, 10 whole decades of its existence. Well, unfortunately, not exactly full or whole. That single century of our university's existence was not without interruption caused by the same unfriendly force that earlier and for a longer time had closed down our older brother, or should I say sister, the University of Vilnius. I mention sister not because that might be politically correct, but because of one person close to VMU. She became an honorary doctor of our university in 1993 after having been a student in our humanities faculty just before the outbreak of World War II, and then moving to her native city of Vilnius, where in 1942 she completed her archaeology studies before being forced to flee to the West along with several tens of thousands of other Lithuanians. Flee from the same unfriendly force I just mentioned, and to which we'll briefly return later. But for now, let's just stay a bit with Marija Gimbutienė in canonical Lithuanian, who after receiving her PhD from the University of Tübingen in Germany in 1946 for a thesis on prehistoric burial rites in Lithuania, did postgraduate work at the University of Heidelberg and Munich. In 1949, she emigrated to the United States and began with menial jobs before getting hired to teach first at Harvard and then at the University of California from 1963 onwards until her retirement, when she already had become truly world famous for showing the ways human civilization had been formed, not just by men, but also, and arguably primarily, by women. Actually, she discovered and described a wholly new civilization that before her no one had so much as an inkling of. That's why her claims were highly controversial, but that's usually the case with exciting scholarly discoveries. It was new in the sense of very, very old, a civilization that existed from 7,000 to 3,500 BC, before it was replaced by the newly arrived war-loving Indo-Europeans. The civilization she had discovered, according to her, had been peaceful civilization of prospering villages and towns where women, especially mothers, set the tone. Human life was valued and safeguarded. Women and men had equal rights, engaged in agriculture, worshipped the great maternal goddess, and crafted wonderful works of art. Gimbutas called this the ancient Europe, or the civilization of the goddess, and interpreted its existence and nature through a unique methodological approach she developed herself. A fusion of archaeology, mythology, folklore, linguistics, and aesthetics. In accordance with this, Gimbutas urged the adoption of a new way of looking at the world's past and at the prospects for its future. She rejected viewing the past in terms of the wars that shaped society and allegedly separated the winners from the losers, and thus she rejected defining a superior civilization in terms of the victories won by its hardy warriors. In her view, what makes any civilization powerful is not its military successes, but the artistic creativity it promotes and the immaterial values that it cherishes. It is these creative and spiritual values that cause the lives of people to be meaningful and pleasant, rather than solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in the memorable and frightening words of Thomas Hobbes. I think that Marija Gimbutas believed that life can again become meaningful and pleasant for most people if only they stop believing in the myth of continuous technological progress and began understanding that what is now held to be progress, in fact, destroys the conditions necessary for a good life on Earth. But was life ever meaningful and pleasant for most people? I suspect again that she would shift her gaze many thousands of years backward to the ancient Europe that she had discovered and declared that back then life indeed was not solitary, poor, nasty, and brutish, though admittedly it might have been short, but just because modern medicine had not yet been discovered. And modern medicine is one of the few really good things about the modern age. One of the best texts in Lithuanian on Marija Gimbutienė is an interview the photographer Neringa Rekašiūtė did with scholar Rasa Navickaitė, who had delved deeply into the archaeologist's life, work, and archives. Navickaitė says that she, quote, immediately bumped up against the most varied interpretations, with some people taking Gimbutienė very seriously as a person of influence, while others looked at her books with disdain, calling them unscientific idealizations. According to Professor Violeta Kellertas, Gimbutienė, this is still in the Rekašiūtė quote, but she quotes Kellertas, Gimbutienė was controversial because in the United States she came to be associated with spiritualistic feminists who believe in crystals, and that's why she wasn't taken seriously in academic circles. But to prevent misunderstanding, that was the end of the quote, and this is Mykolas, but to prevent misunderstanding, I should make it clear that I think that both Professor Kellertas and Professor Gimbutienė, as well as in fact most rational people today, are feminists, not in the sense of having wacky beliefs, but in the sense of deeply believing that all human beings, all women and men, have the same human rights and deserve equal respect. To return to Marija Gimbutienė, this quote continues from Neringa Rekašiūtė's book. She first gained recognition because of her Kurgan hypothesis, by which she explained the origin of the Indo-Europeans and their gradual spread through the territory of contemporary Europe. This hypothesis, which she developed in the 1950s, had the Indo-Europeans originating in the steppes, extending along the northern shore of the Black Sea. Now this hypothesis is held to be the most credible of all and was recently partially confirmed by genetic research, end of quote. This area from which the Indo-Europeans are thought to have descended is the homeland of the Yamnaya, a late Copper Age to early Bronze Age archaeological culture. As the science journalist Douglas Preston wrote in the December 14, 2020 issue of The New Yorker, the idea that Indo-European languages emanated from the Yamnaya homeland was established in 1956 by the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutienė. Her view, known as the Kurgan hypothesis, named for the distinctive burial mounds that spread west across Europe, is now the most widely accepted theory about Indo-European linguistic origins. But where many archaeologists envisioned a gradual process of cultural diffusion, Gimbutienė saw continuous waves of expansions or raids. And he continues to cite Douglas Preston. As her career progressed, her ideas became more controversial. In Europe previously, Gimbutienė hypothesized men and women held relatively equal places in a peaceful, female-centered, goddess-worshipping society, as evidenced by the famous fertility figurines of the time. She believed that the nomads from the Caspian steppes imposed a male-dominated warrior culture of violence, sexual inequality, and social stratification, in which women were subservient to men and a small number of elite males accumulated most of the wealth and power. The DNA from the Iberian skeletons can't tell us what kind of culture the Yamnaya replaced, but it does much to corroborate Gimbutienė's sense that the descendants of the Yamnaya caused much greater disruption than other archaeologists believed. Even today, the Y chromosomes of almost all men of Western European ancestry have a high percentage of Yamnaya-derived genes, suggesting that violent conquest may have been widespread. End of quote from the journalist. And Mykolas, back to Mykolas, Iberian here refers to one or more peoples anciently inhabiting not the peninsula comprising Spain and Portugal, but the Caucasus in Asia, between the Black and Caspian Seas. Prior to imaginatively postulating a hitherto unknown but very ancient pre-Indo-European civilization, Gimbutienė more conventionally contributed to a deeper understanding of the prehistory of the Baltic and Slavic peoples, as well as developed the Kurgan hypothesis, for which she initially became famous. But it's precisely her later notion that prior to the violent invasion of the Indo-Europeans, the civilization of Neolithic Europe had been harmonious, produced high-quality artifacts, and had a social system that was matristic and matrilineal, in which the religious and political spheres were dominated by women, but without sexual oppression, It was this civilization of the motherly deity, the discovery and celebration of which Gimbutas herself regarded as her most valuable contribution to scholarship, but which was less enthusiastically or even coldly received by her peers. By her peers in archaeology, who regarded her vision as wishful thinking and much too idyllic. When in 1974 she published her first book on this topic, The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, 6,500 to 3,500 BC, Myths and Cult Images, no one really noticed or reacted to it. Her authority began to wane only in the late 1980s, when her physical health also decreased, even as she published 2 new books, The Language of the Goddess in 1989, and The Civilization of the Goddess, The World of Old Europe in 1991. So in summary, her earthly existence came to an end in 1994 in Los Angeles after an eventful life that included a happy childhood following her birth in 1921 in Vilnius as Marija Birutė Alseikaitė, to loving parents Veronika Janulaitytė Alseikienė and Danielius Alseika, both physicians and Lithuanian activists in then Polish-occupied Vilnius. It goes on with more biographical information, which I will summarize. It included comparatively rare events for 2 generations of Lithuanians. Her parents were separated, and she herself separated from her husband, Jurgis Gimbutas, with whom she had 3 daughters, one of whom, Živilė Gimbutaitė, not only authored 2 books in English on literature, but also taught Lithuanian émigré literature and English here at VMU. The connection to VMU was manifest even more strongly in the case of the architect and engineer Jurgis Gimbutas, who graduated from VMU in 1941 and then continued to teach there until 1944, when the family was forced to flee westward to Germany, where Jurgis Gimbutas resumed his activities as a teacher at the UNRWA University, that's United Nations Relief Organization University for Displaced Persons in Munich from 1946 to 1948, before earning his PhD at the University of Stuttgart for a dissertation on Lithuanian rustic architecture. While both Maria and Jurgis intently pursued and were at times hugely successful in their professional lives, they also actively participated in Lithuanian community life. Maria Gimbutas especially left a mark not only in the Lithuanian immigration, but also in the intellectual life of Soviet-occupied Lithuania. There are 2 lines leading from Maria Gimbutas to 2 other very great luminaries. In one case, the connection is not from Maria Gimbutas directly, but runs from a favorite teacher of hers, the prominent linguist Antanas Salys, from whom, by her own testimony, she took nearly 10 courses in linguistics that he taught at VMU and later at Vilnius University. Before becoming a successful educator, Salys studied from 1923 to 1925 at the University of Lithuania, which was rechristened VMU in 1930. One of his teachers there was a Swiss linguist, Alfred Senn, and I will skip most of what he says about Senn because we have here a representative of the Senn family. In Mykolas's paper is much too long to fit in the time frame. So I will skip most of what he says about Senn because we have someone here who will talk extensively about the Senn heritage. And Mykolas himself suggested, because the paper was so long, that I also skip the part about Algirdas Julius Greimas, because Algirdas, again, it's too lengthy, and Mykolas agreed that I should skip it. I will only mention that Alfred Senn is considered to be one of the 4 great philologists of the Lithuanian language who had taught at Vytautas Magnus University and spent the last decades of their life in the United States. The other 3 were Dr. Salys, 1902 to 1972, Dr. Pranas Karadžius, 1899 to 1975, and Dr. Petras Jonikas, from 1906 to 1996. The latter was not only a teacher, but also a student here. Okay. And now to Algirdas Avižienis. One of the most illustrious Lithuanian-born scholars at what might be called the hard sciences, actually it is the hard sciences, with a lively interest in the humanities, especially music, and a very close connection to Vytautas Magnus University. He was too young to be a student there during the first period of Lithuanian independence, but as the second period neared, he was a vital member of the movement to have VMU reestablished in 1989 after its closure in 1950 by the Soviet government. I'm talking, of course, about Algirdas Avižienis, who served as a second rector of the resuscitated VMU from 1990 to 1993, to which he brought his Western mentality and unmatched experience as a scholar of the computer science department at the University of California at Los Angeles, where he is now a distinguished professor emeritus, and where from the 1960s onwards until the most recent years, he did research reflected in nearly 200 trend-setting publications with such titles as A Class of Number Representation for Parallel Arithmetic, The Design of Digital Circuits to Eliminate Catastrophic Failures, System Organization of the JPL Self-Testing and Repairing Computer and its extension to a multiprocessor configuration, Design of Fault-Tolerant Computers, Design Methods for Fault-Tolerant Navigation Computers, Self-Testing and Repairing Aerospace Computer for Automatic Maintenance of Unmanned Interplanetary Spacecraft. The discipline of fault-tolerant computing would be unnecessary if computer hardware and programs would always behave in perfect agreement with the designer's or programmer's intentions. However, imperfections of computer systems and program bugs have been with us since the first computer was built, and fault tolerance will remain an important objective as long as computers are in demand. Anyway, this was just a partial list of the publications and theses produced in his professional life by the computer science and interplanetary communication specialist, Professor Algirdas Avižienis. But there was and is also his Lithuanian life, both in the United States and the West as a whole, and in Lithuania itself, where we've already talked about his input into the revival of VMU, in which he did not attend before World War II, but keeping alive the memory of its former professors, active in the diaspora, contributed to VMU's reestablishment in 1989 by continuing its academic traditions through the organization every 2 or 3 years since 1969 of the Symposiums of Science and Creativity, both in the United States and later in Lithuania. It's quite fitting that while Algirdas Avižienis was the main spirit behind the Symposia of Lithuanian scholars in the United States, the symposium marking the 100th anniversary of VMU in Kaunas is devoted to globally important scholars who kept alive VMU's inquisitive spirit and even boosted it in their peerless work abroad. Thanks.
Thank you, Skirma, for such job that you did. And of course, we are grateful to Mykolas DRUNGA for his presentation. Are we going to discuss now? No. So let us move to the second presentation, and Anne, who is a daughter and also granddaughter of two prominent scholars, Professor Alsen and Al Eriksson. And she talks about the light that was taken from Kaunas to Wisconsin and brought back after the Soviet Union collapsed. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. So actually, I have to start my talk with 3 apologies. Like what a great way to start a talk, right? I apologize, I do not speak Lithuanian. I'm embarrassed by it. I apologize that I am neither philologist nor historian, so all I can tell you today are some stories, and I thought maybe to help out I'd bring some really beautiful pictures. This is a picture of my grandmother. My grandmother is why I'm here today. She was born in 1899 in Raudonvary's castle. Her father was a caretaker of the property for a Polish count. So that's kind of cool. She used to tell stories of, you know, as a young girl watching all the beautiful parties that were happening at Raudonvary's. And this picture is of sort of very important in our family lore, because it was in 1922 when my grandfather came to Kaunas from Switzerland that she met. But she was already engaged to a German baron, and he's the one who gave her this dog. So this picture, there's 2 copies of it. I have one now, But it was just kind of interesting. She chose my grandfather, a Swiss linguist, over a German baron. They were married, and I have a picture. They were married in 1923, only 3 months after they met. That was quite quick. They had 2 girls, and then later in 1932, they ended up in the United States. The man to the right of my grandfather's in the center, and the man to the right is Judita SEDAITIS, and so I'll talk about him in just a moment. But they were great friends, and of course, all part of the wedding. So, my grandfather, it's a little bit difficult. I have 3 things to navigate here. So my grandfather, he was born in Alsace, Switzerland. Oh, yes, okay. And we'll just go, yeah, move ahead. All right. So my grandfather was born in the Alsace region of France, and well, in Switzerland, that later became France. And he grew up in St. Gallen, and in St. Gallen, they had amazing language programs, and that's how he became interested in linguistics. And in St. Gallen, he studied 9 languages: German, Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Hebrew, English, Spanish, and Dutch, and of course, he got perfect marks in everything. He then studied at the University of Freiburg, and it was in Freiburg that he met Judita SEDAITIS. He also met leading members of the Lithuanian freedom movement at the time. So this was late 1918, 1919. And he was actually 1917. So he was moved by their passion and began writing articles to encourage the Swiss passion for Lithuanian freedom. He also began speaking with Swiss politicians as a student. SEDAITIS graduated and moved to Kaunas, and my father, when he graduated, when he got his doctorate, followed SEDAITIS to Lithuania. So he and SEDAITIS then contributed to what was a growing Swiss presence here in Kaunas. Move ahead. My father was absolutely fascinated by the Lithuanian language. So he looked at the 1918 Declaration of Independence and felt that that was a document of linguistic freedom as well as political freedom, because that was the first time Lithuanian was used in a formal context. Due to SEDAITIS, he was able to meet linguistic scholars like Professor Dr. Kazimieras Būga and also Professor Jonas Jablonskis. And they were obviously already working on the Lithuanian language, had been working on the Lithuanian language for years. And my grandfather was very excited to join into their efforts. So he was offered a teaching position at the University of Lithuania in 1922. And this slide has a few pages from the faculty directory. So you might be able to recognize my grandfather if you look down the crease, and just to the right, that's my grandfather in the bottom center there. And just above him is Judita SEDAITIS, the guy with the really great hair. And other pages of this directory are also quite interesting. You'll see Antanas Smetona also in this directory. So if you move forwards, yep. So this is, I have to say something about my grandfather's dictionary work. For me, this is really the epitome of a life's work. It began really upon his entry into Vytauto, the University of Lithuania, because Būga came to my grandfather and said, well, you should start a dictionary project. So it started in 1923 and it ended in 1968. So 5 volumes, and just think about this. It spanned countries, mother tongues, eras, and collaborators. The work stretched on for decades. And of course, a lot happened. Life didn't stop and language didn't stop. So it was really, really interesting. If you think about the technology that they were using, it was typewriter, carbon copy, telegraph, and the documents came from Lithuania through Switzerland to the United States, Madison, Wisconsin, of all places, back to Switzerland and back into Lithuania. The first volume was produced in 1932, or 1923, sorry. And it was based on a manuscript that Buga had given to my grandfather. Max Niedermann, a Swiss linguist, joined the project right away. And later, several others joined, including Antanas Salis. Antanas Salis began with the second volume. Like, I don't know, my grandfather in the forewords of the dictionary, like if you really want to have some interesting reading, you can read the forewords and the nachwort of the dictionary, because he describes this whole project. And it's actually really quite sad, because the nachwort includes the whole description of the project plus the three that died during the creation of it. It just was on so long. So Buga died in 1924. My grandfather took over his role at the University of Lithuania. Buga was teaching Lithuanian linguistics. And so my grandfather ended up as a Swiss, German-speaking Swiss, teaching Lithuanian linguistics at the college level. And apparently that was quite controversial. You might imagine it would be a little controversial. And Antanas Smetona himself wrote, saying how disappointed he was that it was foreigners teaching Lithuanian, and how that was going to, you know, maybe that was not such a great thing, and that soon these foreigners would be speaking Lithuanian better than some of the Lithuanian notables. My grandfather actually took that a little bit to heart. It hurt. Anyways, in 1930, he emigrated to the United States. And as I said, the dictionary project continued. It was broken up during the war. Work stopped. My grandfather continued to collect materials for it. And the next volume was produced in 1951. And the fifth and final volume, again, in 1968. 35 years, or 65. Wait, 45 years after the original discussion with Buga. So this is a picture of my grandfather and grandmother in Pennsylvania. They were strong and active members of the, at the time, growing and grew a lot afterwards, the Lithuanian American community. First in Wisconsin, and then later in Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And when my grandfather, after he got his position at the University of Pennsylvania, learned that former colleagues were showing up in displaced persons camps in Germany and in Austria, he rushed to help them. And two of those that he helped were Vingas Kreva and Antanas Salis. So he helped them get to the United States and get settled and find positions. He actually helped many Lithuanians settle and find work in the United States. And in his own words, and he wrote this, he felt a sense of service in being a Swiss linguist able to serve the Lithuanian people. So I remember him as extremely proper, always very well dressed, always wearing a suit. I was a child, right? And my grandmother was not just dressed, she was always dressy. They spoke kind of, to my ears, a wild mixture of Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, German, and English with all of us, sometimes wanting us to understand them and sometimes not. At home, they spoke Lithuanian. For me, when grandmother would draw me a bath, she'd say, "Ne šaltas, bet šlapas." So she tried to teach me a little bit. If you can go forwards. So let me tell you a little about my father's story. So more than a year after my grandfather moved to the United States, my grandmother followed, and she followed with two young girls. So made that whole trip on the boat to the United States with two girls. They settled in Madison, where my grandfather found a teaching position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my dad was born in Madison in 1932. I think that's a great picture of him. For those that know him, have you ever seen this picture? I thought you might find that kind of fun. If you go forwards, there's this picture I really love too. This is my father with his sister, Elfrida, and her pet monkey. And if you look really closely, you can see the monkey is wearing a dress. At the command of my parents, or my grandparents, his parents, my dad studied languages. So he studied Russian, Polish, Lithuanian. He was also fascinated by political science. And his family then moved from Madison to Pennsylvania, where my grandfather got his position at the University of Pennsylvania. And my father and all of his siblings also went to the University of Pennsylvania, and my grandfather forced them all to take his language lessons, right? And Kreva was also my father's Russian teacher. So, and Solis and Kreva were frequent dinner guests at my grandparents' house. So you can imagine what the dinner conversations might have been like, right? With my father at the table, with his Russian teacher, Kreva, with Antanas Salis and my grandfather, who were working on Lithuanian language, and my grandmother, who knew them all, everybody correcting my father, but also everybody correcting each other. If you go to the next page, my father then graduated from Columbia. He wrote his master's thesis on early 1919 Lithuanian Soviet Republic, and his doctoral thesis on the 1918 to 1920 formation of the Lithuanian state. So that doctoral thesis was later published as The Emergence of Modern Lithuania in 1959. Now, it turned out that his doctoral thesis was actually quite an important document, because it was one of the very few stories of Lithuania that were available in English. And so it really brought the story to Western scholars. And my father did not realize at the time that not only had he found his place in academia, he had actually also found his calling in life. And he would say that. So moving on, this is a picture of my father and mother. My mother was a chemist, a chemistry grad and lab tech. They met at a picnic and married a year later. My father was offered a tenured position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My brother and I were born in Brooklyn before they left, and my other brother and sister were born in Madison. My father wrote on Baltic and Lithuanian issues for a while, but it was kind of difficult to have much of an audience in the Western world at the time. And since he was hired by the University of Wisconsin to teach Soviet history, he began working on Soviet emigration as a topic, and also Swiss diplomatic relations between World War I and World War II, understanding that a lot of espionage was actually taking place in Switzerland, and he found that really quite interesting. Move forwards. So this is a picture of my dad at his office in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so over time, he really had developed into a Soviet history specialist. And he had the opportunity to meet the legendary Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Switzerland. And it was Solzhenitsyn that turned my father's attention back towards Lithuania. They met in 1975 in Zurich, and Solzhenitsyn at the time shared with my father Solzhenitsyn's deep respect for Lithuanians. He called Lithuanians a noble people. He asked my father why he wasn't writing about Lithuania anymore, and he said, "I don't have the right to tell you what to do, but you should write about them." So it took about 10 years for those words to take effect in my father, for him to start writing again about Lithuania, but he never forgot Solzhenitsyn's words. He was a member, and I should also say that there were a number of other, over that 10-year time, there were another number of other sort of circumstances that began turning my father back towards Lithuania. He was a member of the Lithuanian American communities in the Chicago area, the Madison area, but Pennsylvania and also Connecticut. It was the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and the events leading up to that drew my dad's attention to the intersection of sports and politics. And I see Agidius here who's been studying, right? And my father, because of this interest, began developing a course on the history of the Olympics. And his lectures and books were turned into the book, The Power and Politics of the Olympic Games in 1999. And it was this study of politics and sports in which he noticed the presence of Lithuanian athletes. So a high percentage of the athletes that were really very strong in the Soviet world were Lithuanians. So it was a combination of that. So he started watching the Lithuanians there. He started being very interested in Lithuanians in sport. And it was Arvydas Sabonas's emergence as an international basketball star that gave my dad another opportunity. He had the opportunity to meet Sabonis, and he developed a relationship with Akirache, a Lithuanian language publication out of Chicago, and published some of his articles in Akirache. So then he became, I am a translator for the basketball team when they come to Madison, Wisconsin. He had the opportunity to interview a number of the athletes and write his interviews up. And this became my dad's another career as a journalist. And I'm going to show you a picture in a moment because he's very proud of this. So in 1983, Alphonsus Eidantas then was looking for an American professor to work with. So he wrote to my father. And in 1984, they met in Moscow. Alphonsus, Alpha, as I know him, invited my father to Kaunas. So my father was able to visit Kaunas for the first time, and Raudondvaris, where my grandmother was born. Alpha and my father then collaborated on various topics, including the impact of the Lithuanian emigres before 1914 on the Lithuanian movement. Inspired by, so if you go forwards, sorry, this is my father with the book, the sports book, and then go forwards one more. This is with Alphonsus Eidantas in 1988. And in 1988, Alpha invited my father to Lithuania to study the development of the Lithuanian national feeling. And so he wrote quite a bit about the development of the spirit of Lithuanian nationalism. But because of his sports journalist credentials, again, with Akirache, in 1988, he was able to participate in the SEDAITIS Constituent Convention. And at that convention, somebody stood up and said, they mentioned my father's book. They mentioned his doctoral thesis on the emergence of modern Lithuania and called it a true story of Lithuanian history. My father was just in the audience of this group, and he was a little bit shocked. He's like, that's me. And anyways, he began writing of the SEDAITIS movement, the book that ultimately was published as Lithuania Awakening in 1990. So in 1990, he returned as part of the inaugural Madison-Vilnius Sister City relationship. And that was my first trip to Lithuania. I joined that group in 1990. And the scheduling was completely coincidental with all of the events that were happening, the Baltic Way a few months before. But we were here in January of 1990, which was, of course, Gorbachev's visit to Vilnius. And because, again, my father was a journalist, he was able to attend all of the Gorbachev delegation meetings. And this was, at this point, he was fully invested in all events Lithuania. So this is my father as the journalist, right? Yeah, professor and journalist. He really liked this this little vest that he wore because he could put all of his notebooks in all of the pockets, right? And he had a little recorder as well. So this is yeah, he looks like a correspondent. Yeah, well done. So in 1991, he returned to Lithuania. He was present during the events leading up to and just after the January 13th attack by the Soviets. And I was really grateful for Mykolos's words about my father and also about my grandfather. And he did include my father's diary in his notes from that time. My Uncle Kay and my father got together and they set up a program that they called the Senn'ų Fellows, ultimately called the Senn'ų Fellows. And it was set up with the University of Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the University of Connecticut. And they invited a number of Lithuanians, notable Lithuanians, people who wanted to come and study in the United States. Now, Eidantas, Alpha, was the inspiration for this program. And they supported many Lithuanians who wanted to study in the US. Some you might know, Violeta Močiulaitė, Vytautas Didžiojo, Rimvydas Valatka. And you might know the guy in this next picture, Egidius. I think this is a great picture of Egidius and his wife Dahlia, and it's in front of our house, 133 North Prospect Avenue. And actually it was really interesting because over time, 133 North Prospect Avenue, there was even an article in the Lithuanian paper that had our address and talked about all the Lithuanians that came to visit, yes. Other Sun scholars, Vytautas Didžiojo, and if you go to the next picture, Birutė Gabaravičienė. At the time, she was a journalist working for Kauno Diena. And I'm really not sure where or when this photo was taken, but I do remember meeting Birutė quite a while ago and thinking, oh my gosh, she is wicked smart and really beautiful. So in 1995, my father was inducted as the foreign member of the Lithuanian Academy of Sciences. In 1996, Egidius invited my father to teach at VMU. Now, he was unbelievably pleased to be asked to teach at VMU. It was a great honor. He loved working with students. He was excited to come and teach, but he was particularly excited to come and teach at the same institution that his father had taught at. In 1999, he was awarded the honorary doctorate by VMU, that's in this picture. And if you go forwards one, please. In 2004, he was awarded the Order of the Cross of Vytautas the Great by President Adamkus. And this was also an extremely great honor for my father because he deeply respected President Adamkus. Now the rest, as you might say, is history. My father died in 2016 at the age of 84. He really wanted to make it back for his birthday and his 85th birthday. He loved teaching here. He loved his friends. He called his friends here his Shema. And my father always said, friends are the family that you choose. Now my grandfather, he studied over 40 languages, 40. I don't know that I can name 40 languages. It's embarrassing. He wrote 23 books and monographs and more than 130 articles. And while his mother tongue was German, I went back and I counted how many of his articles were written either in Lithuanian or about Lithuanian, and it was almost half of his articles in Lithuanian or about Lithuanian. And if you add in the dictionary project, you can clearly see that while his mother tongue was German, Lithuanian was really his chosen language. My father wrote 29 books and monographs and over 150 articles. And while he was born in the US, he spoke and wrote in 5 languages: German, English, Polish, Russian, and Lithuanian. And of those, he would claim Lithuanian as the most meaningful for him. His connection with Lithuania was through family and through language. Now, for my part, my language instruction started early, if you would. But clearly I had the wrong idea. I did not inherit the talent of my grandfather and my father, but I have had the chance to visit Lithuania and have gotten to know this beautiful country and the people here. If you go forwards one more. Back to my grandmother. As a young adult and mother myself, I really admire the strength of my grandmother. She lost her citizenship when she married my grandfather. She was ridiculed by Lithuanian authorities that she had to get a foreigner's visa in order to leave Lithuania. She traveled to the United States, again by herself, with 2 young girls. So it's a long trip. She made a new life in Madison and a new life in Pennsylvania for the family. And she became a US citizen, but she became a US citizen only because she was afraid that because of where she was born and the controversy over Radonvery's, the site, and so on, that she would be declared a Soviet citizen at some point. She was fiercely proud to be Lithuanian American. She was fiercely proud to be, she was fiercely proud of my father and my grandfather. And she shared her light with others. So I've been privileged to work with Dr. Daiva KUZMICKAITÐ and researching today's Lithuanian American consciousness. And this has given me greater insight into the strength and power of the Lithuanian community here and abroad. If you go forwards, I'm really proud of the dedication and the work of my grandfather and my father. My father, as teacher, would be extremely disappointed with me if I did not take just a quick moment and summarize what he taught. And for many of you in here who are either his students or his friends, you can correct me on this, but here's a couple of thoughts. He says, always look at the facts. Don't be swayed by the popular opinion. He said, you need to seek and understand and look for multiple perspectives on things. But people will understand things from different perspectives. He said he loved puzzles. And he said, for him, research was like putting together a puzzle. He needed to put all the pieces together and figure out how they fit together. He also said you need to know your internal elephant. That is your own worldview that you bring to the perspective that you are, the problem that you're working on. Make sure you know your own worldview. And your worldview may not line up with anyone else's, but make sure you know that. He said, go ahead and break the rules. When academia was starting to drive people to go deep, be narrow, be deep in your topics, as I've described to you, he went broad, right? He covered a lot of different topics. He said, also you need to be curious about the people. That's why I stopped to tell you the stories of their lives here as opposed to simply diving into their works. He believed that you should get to know the people behind the history, the people behind the stories, so that you could understand them better. I loved visiting stores and restaurants with my father because he would always strike up conversations with whoever it was that was serving us or in there. And invariably, he would leave with them giving him a hug and telling them about their kids and everything else. He was just very easy to talk with. He said you should work at your craft. He always worked at writing his writing. He worked at being a journalist. He worked at being a good lecturer, a good speaker. He said to make sure that you tell the story and understand the story. Find the narrative that explains these facts that you're looking at. And be sure to be engaging. He said to be alert. You never know when you might play a role in some momentous event or play a role in history. He also said to take criticism in stride. Be who you are. Now, Landsbergis once said to my father, you write with insider knowledge, but with an outsider perspective. My father could only agree with him. So his multiple interests and his shifts can only make sense when you look backwards through his life, and it only made sense to him looking backwards. His love of history, music, arts, literature, language, sports, and political science, and his various disciplines as researcher, journalist, author, singer, and teacher. It's absolutely impossible to summarize the lives of these two here, but I will just leave you with, my grandfather found his calling in serving the Lithuanian people, and my father did as well. So I have really been very pleased to be here and share their stories, and I appreciate that.
So thank you, Anne, very much. It was, as you said, you were not very happy that you are here to present your story, but it was so powerful because personal stories, life stories, they give a very powerful message, and I think we all agree, and we are saying thank you for you. And one thing you mentioned, that was the moment your father met Solzhenitsyn, and he encouraged him for going further into studies of Lithuanian history and politics and so on. And this reminds me about that university, or Vytautas Magnus University, or Lithuanian University. We are not just a bubble. We are like a virtual community of people who are searching for knowledge, for some improvements, some development. And Ingrida told me that our community, our virtual community, is bigger because Professor Avižienis has joined us, and we have opportunity to say hello to him, as I understood correctly, right? I don't know. I hope he can see us. Oh yeah. So good morning, good evening, and we can go further, right? And our next presenter is Indrė Čiuplinskas, and she will share her, I don't know, experience, her perspective. So the floor is yours.
Labas rytas, good morning. So I have been asked to weave together a number of threads of stories for this symposium. First, to talk about Švento Antano Religinių Studijų Institutas, St. Anthony's Religious Studies Institute in Kretinga, an institution in Samogitia in Žemaitija that was affiliated with Vytautas Magnus University. And secondly, I was asked to do so from a personal perspective, by including Lithuanian diaspora experiences that influenced my decision to come to Kretinga. And thirdly, to tie this in with the theme of today's symposium, what carries light when darkness abounds? So in 12 to 15 minutes, here we go. So part one, Švento Antano, a Religious Studies Institute. Here we have a picture, a 1930s sketch of St. Anthony's. The building was actually funded in part by donations from diaspora Lithuanians already in the interwar period. So the connections between the institution and the Lithuanian diaspora are found from its very beginnings. But I'll be talking about what happened in this building in the 1990s and onwards. So in 1994, having completed a master's degree in religious studies at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, I arrived in Kretinga, where I was an instructor and then dean of Švento Antano Religious Studies Institute. And during my 2 years there, the institute completed the affiliation process with Vytautas Magnus University, joining the Faculty of Catholic Theology. And for the next decade, students studying in Kretinga would receive bachelor degrees from VDU or VMU. So the institute itself was founded in 1989, and in its first 6 years went through different iterations. So it started in 1989 as a girls' school of home aesthetics, right, in Šiaulių Pedagogical Institute's Klaipėdos Faculty of Early Childhood Education. Anyways, a very complex kind of series of affiliations. So it started in Klaipėda. In 1990, it changed to Klaipėdos Catholic Girls College. And then it moved to Kretinga. So in 1991, it became the Kretinga Catholic Girls College, and this is when the Franciscans became involved. They became involved in 1990, and it came under Franciscan influence. Then in 1991, 1992, it was renamed as Švento Antano Collegia or college, and then they opened it up to young men. Okay, so within 3 years, it moved from just a women's institution to one with men. 1993, it was approved as a post-secondary institution by the government. And then I arrived in 1994 to 96, so that's kind of the period that I was there. As I mentioned, I was both an instructor and academic dean for a year. And within that time period in 1995, the institute affiliated with Vytautas Magnus University in the Catholic Faculty of Theology. And then it continued to exist for another 10 years, closing in 2005. So it's an institution that had a 16-year existence. And I think, you kind of have 6 years of initial development and kind of finding its identity. 5 years of, I think, real flourishing, and then probably about 5 years of decline. So although the Institute billed itself as an institution for training catechists and religion teachers, it was in many ways an experiment and response to the fluid situation right after the reinstatement of Lithuanian independence. Students studied, and you've got a list here of the various things, so theology, philosophy, pedagogy, literature, fine arts, music. And again, the intended specialization was fairly narrow, but I think they did really receive a solid liberal education. And most importantly, I think that after almost 5 decades of an atheistic regime, with the reinstitution of Lithuanian independence, there was a strong desire among Lithuanians to engage religious faith, and in particular, the Catholic intellectual tradition, one which honors both faith and reason. And the Institute, in a dynamic way, responded to this palpable need. So, and it was also, I think, a creative experiment between church and state, and a religious order and a university. So the life of the Institute was deeply shaped by the Franciscan order. There you've got a few Franciscans sitting around listening to a talk. They were involved in the leadership of the institution. They provided a number of instructors, and they also provided pastoral and spiritual programming. So I think anybody who studied at the Institute had a very clear clear sense of the Franciscan presence. The instructors were a mix of instructors. They came from different countries, so we did have Franciscans teaching there, Franciscans from Lithuania, but also Poland, Germany, Italy, and the US. There were instructors, there were some religious sisters from the United States. There were also instructors and administrators from the Lithuanian diaspora, like myself. And of course, there were Lithuanian academics, some full-time, some part-time, coming from places like Klaipėda. So this mix of instructors from different countries and different educational traditions also, I think, enriched the life of the students, right? And their experience was diverse in that way. In some ways, it was what they were studying was narrow in some ways, but they were getting perspectives from various cultures. The student body itself, whoops, keep moving, back, yeah. Back, one more. Okay, okay, students, good. Okay, so just a few little descriptions of them, at least while I was there. Now I've met some people here in the audience who graduated later, but when I was there, it was still about 90% female. The majority came from smaller towns, but really from all of Lithuania. So it was rooted in Žemaitijoje and Samogityje, but the student body did come from all of Lithuania. And students had a very intense communal life there because most of them lived in the dormitory. So really their lives were, from morning till evening, they were spending time together. And it wasn't a huge institution, right? There are probably not more than about 100 students at any given time, and you'd have maybe a class of 43, I think was one of the largest graduating classes. So if you were to talk to former students about their experiences at the Institute, and I was a teacher, but I suspect that they would highlight the communal aspect of their studies, an intense experience of community life that was both academic, spiritual, and it also had a larger outreach into the community. So it wasn't just a purely academic experience. And so what also characterized the Institute was its outreach activities. Here we've got a picture of the choir, Judita. So there were concerts, there were plays, there were conferences, cultural events, social and charitable projects, and also pastoral work in parishes and with the Franciscans. So again, kind of a multi-layered life, and definitely, again, not an institution that was closed in on itself. It really made an imprint on the town of Kretinga and on the region beyond. So that's a brief description of the Institute. So now we're going to move to part 2, and this is networks and threads that brought me to the Institute. So I was born and raised during the Cold War in Canada's largest Lithuanian community, a sort of tight-knit village in Toronto, which is a cosmopolitan city of over 3 million people. So in Toronto, the Lithuanian community had a very well-developed infrastructure. It was built up mostly by DPs after the Second World War. There were 2 Catholic parishes, a Lutheran parish, a non-denominational Lithuanian hall, a Saturday school, 2 dance groups, numerous choirs, scouts, ateitininkai, 2 sports clubs, a summer camp, and a cemetery when it's all done. I first visited Lithuania in 1987 when I was 19 and a student at the Lithuanian high school in Germany at Vasario 16. So in short, I grew up in a very intentional and active Lithuanian diaspora environment. And I'm not going to highlight all of those things. I will highlight just 3 threads, 3 networks that I think were particularly important to my decision to work at Švento Antano in Kretinga. And there are also threads that tie my own life actually to Vytautas Didžiojo University, Vytautas Magnus University. So the first thread is ateitininkai. Ateitininkai, the futurists, never a very good translation for them, but because it has other connotations. Ateitininkai are a Catholic intellectual youth organization founded in 1910, and just to link my talk to Ann Senn's, Juozas Eritas was a very important leader, and we were showing the photos there of the yearbook from BMU, like half the people there were involved in the Ateitis movement. So it's an organization founded in 1910 whose members played a significant role in the life of Vytautas Magnus University and in the interwar Lithuanian Republic. Many of the organization's active members were exiled during the Second World War, and they became cornerstones of the Lithuanian diaspora. So I have 2 photos, one from 1935 that links this organization to Vytauto Didžiojo University, and then a picture of ateitininkai in the United States today. So I grew up as part of this organization, and growing up in it meant that one was woven into a larger Lithuanian diaspora network. I took part in events in Toronto, but also attended courses and summer camps, as pictured there in Camp Dainava, Michigan, with youth from all over North America. And so ateitininkai provided a larger community that had a very clear historical links to Lithuania and to this university. The courses that ateitininkai organized for students fostered in me, still a high school student, a deeper interest in the Western intellectual tradition through lectures given by the Lithuanian diaspora's intellectuals, often university professors, many of whom actually, again, were involved in the reestablishment of Vytauto Didžiojo universitetas. And these lecturers and these various activities cultivated a link to Lithuania, its history and culture, while at the same time lifting our diasporic identity beyond a limited parochial horizon. This organization, ateitininkai, cultivated my lifelong interest in religion and in intellectual history, such that now, as a historian, I am in the midst of a comparative study of interwar ateitininkai with other movements, similar movements in Europe and North America. So that was the first thread. The second whoops. The second thread, the Franciscans. Lithuanian Franciscan friars were among the many refugees of World War II. In North America, they founded a number of friaries, one of them in my hometown, Toronto. They were also involved in the cultural life of the Lithuanian diaspora, publishing numerous periodicals. So I grew up in Toronto's Lithuanian Franciscan parish. We've got a picture there of the newer church built about 20 years ago. And as Lithuania moved towards independence in the late 1980s and early 1990s, religious orders that had been banned during the Soviet Union began to revive. My ties to the Franciscans in Toronto meant that I became acquainted with the young friars, the young Franciscan brothers, who were rebuilding the order in Lithuania and running St. Švento Antano in Kretinga. In fact, my Toronto parish sponsored 2 alumni of Švento Antano to study at the Catholic University of Leuven at the same time that I was there. So these personal links also influenced my decision to ask the friars in Kretinga whether they could use my expertise at the Institute in Kretinga once I had completed my master's degree. And the third thread. This is a thread that I really only kind of became conscious of as I prepared for this talk, because I thought I have to link this to Vytauto Didžiojo in some way. And it's perhaps a subtle one and shaped me in unconscious ways, but one which I really felt compelled to include here. And it's a family thread going back to my grandmother. So Anne, I'm glad you talked about your grandmother. So here's mine. So in my office in Western Canada, I have this photo hanging in my office of the 1934 graduating class of Vytauto Didžiojo Universiteto Dentistry Department. And amongst the instructors is my maternal grandmother. So if you click, there she is. Aniceta Stonkutė Matulionenė, looking very chic in her very short haircut there. And amongst the students, all women, as you can see, is my great aunt. Thus, I am a granddaughter of Vytauto Didžiojo Universiteto alumna and instructor. And in Canada, I grew up surrounded by close friends of my grandmother who were treated like family. They were all students of this university. They had studied medicine, law, and literature. And I didn't think about this consciously, but I inevitably grew up in the shadow of these well-educated, intellectually inquisitive women. And even by Canadian standards, this was a rare thing, right? Most of my peers don't have grandmothers who taught in universities. And only as I prepared for this talk did I realize that actually 60 years after this photo was taken, I went to Lithuania in 1994 to teach mostly women, primarily Lithuanian women, who would graduate from Vytautas Magnus University. There were some fine men at the institute also, a number of whom have become leaders of the Franciscan order, and I am confident that having studied religion with women has influenced the way that they live out their vocations. But that's another topic. Okay, so as I prepared for this talk and pondered Švento Antano Religious Studies Institute and my own journey there, my own journey to it and my experiences there, it felt at first that I was trying to create order amidst a pile of random threads. And moreover, I wondered what all of this may have to say to this seminar's topic, what carries light when darkness abounds. So I'm going to counter my brother's talk yesterday. He said we shouldn't necessarily look for narratives, but I tried to find a narrative in this. So then instead of random threads, I could look at all of this as this random bunch of threads, but I did suddenly see networks that intersected, intertwined, and shaped each other. And these were life-giving and life-transforming networks, relationships between family, between friends, links between organizations, ties amongst professionals. And these networks also became conduits for the exchange of ideas. And as a teacher, I am convinced that ideas are best exchanged and developed when there are relationships between people, relationships of affection and trust. I don't think we ever convince anybody by yelling at them. I think we convince each other when we do have affection and trust. And I learned a lot of that in the community that I taught at Švento Antano. There was this relationships of affection and trust, and I think teaching happened in a different way. And so for me, what carries light when darkness abounds, I think it is these networks, these relationships. We need to know that we're not alone, that we have ties to people, ties of affection and trust that allow us then to to explore ideas, new ideas and old ideas, to adapt existing structures or construct new institutions, to create novel plans that respond to the challenges of the day. And lastly, I'm thankful to some of my former students who had actually written up the basic historical facts of the institution. I did make use of those and photographs that students took from their years in Švento Antano Religious Studies Institute. Ačiū.
So thank you for all of our three speakers. And now probably it's time to start the discussion. We have two people who are ready and to share their ideas, their insights. So probably we can start with Dr. Judita SEDAITIS, and Ramūnas KONDRATAS could share his impressions a little bit later. So thank you.
Thank you very much. They're very impressive, very rich 3 talks. To really give each its due would take much longer time than I have. But I want to say, jumping off from where Indra left us, that this is a session built on narrative, and in some ways a carryover from yesterday, talking about how narrative is at the heart, perhaps, of teaching and scholarship. It gives flesh and bone, brings to life theory that might be dry to our students, and certainly the lives of the people mentioned here do that very well. In the beginning, I think I thought of each talk as centered on the big torches, big names of important people like Gimbutas and Senn'ų, who really were torches of light, and given the history of Lietuva after the occupation, went out into the world carrying that light. I just have to say, an argument with DRUNGA, my dear friend Mykolas, I think a lot of women in teaching on women in society, as I do, talk about Gimbutas to receptions that are very favorable. But these torches that went out into the light and coming to America, for instance, like a lot of us are from, I think needed to be nurtured in an atmosphere that was conducive to them. And yet the problem of being a scholar in exile is a deep and dark one. I think Milosas Ceslo wrote very well about it, and Kavolis, to my mind, echoed his sentiment that to speak in a way that is acceptable in your new country of origin as an exile, you lose your language and your culture and your connection to that which gave you the light. And yet to speak in your own language about your own culture, you're speaking to an empty room. So the light that was brought from Lietuva had to reconnect somehow to Lietuva. And I know that the authors, the Hebra around Akirache, encountered some resistance and pushback when they first called for Veda I Lietuva. But their founding philosophy was, we need oxygen to keep the light alive. And we need to be able to communicate with people who are still Lietuvė, Lietuviškai. And one fount of that kindling flame was the symposium in Chicago, the symposiums that happened in Chicago. And yesterday I learned from the rector that those symposia were actually reverberated back here, and were in some ways the grain that started VDU. Well, those symposia were a way for us to connect back, a bridge back to Lietuva, the culture, the language, not the regime, of course, but we needed to be able to have what Indra ended her talk with, that network. Those big torches of the big minds are essential, but without the network that they kindled, that kept the culture alive for people like me, born and raised in Chicago, I stopped speaking Lithuanian when I was 19. And because by accident, I just came upon, at a bar, came upon these people that were the editors of Akirache, I realized that there was a philosophy and a rich history and of ideas that came from Lithuanians, and that encouraged me to come back to the culture and to learn the language and to speak eventually at a symposium in Chicago. The question that I would like to raise for discussion, if that's possible, is to bring us now into the present. The light now comes from a free and vibrant Lietuva, and it radiates out into the world. But as I mentioned yesterday, my concern is that it comes back to the source, to here. That I think Lietuva's looking out, as it should. We're in a global network of knowledge. But what will keep the embers burning here when so much of the light leaves? Thank you.
Well, the Black chronicler always speaks last. I dressed up appropriately. I'd like to add my own comment. I really like the title about the light, and because it refers to knowledge. And then I remembered that the motto of Yale University is Lux et Veritas, light and truth. Whereas Harvard's only Veritas, only truth. Well, that's a minor point. I already told Ann that I have no further comments on her wonderful presentation. I only met her father once, I think, in Madison when I was there for a conference. So I have nothing to add. And I really liked into this notion of networks, and I'll speak to that a little bit of my own experiences, which is maybe a little closer to Judita's, but it still has that, your network hypothesis is a very good one. I'll have to spend a little more time with Mykolas's paper, because in his abstract, Mykolo says that he wants to put the contributions of the VMU faculty or students in some worldwide perspective, their contributions to world science, as he says. And I think that's important to do, but to do that, you have to know that science, a little bit about that science or those fields, to be able to really put them into that broad perspective. And I think historians are best adapted to do that, because that's their trade. And mine as a historian of science is especially true. I learned in my work for 32 years at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where I did a lot of exhibits. I never used the word first, because you always find somebody who did it simultaneously. I always say one of the first, or a pioneer. And therefore, to say that Maria Gimbutas discovered a civilization, I mean, is such hyperbole that I think any historian or others would not take anything after he says seriously. She did not discover any civilization. What the civilization that he refers to is old Europe, that she sort of composed primarily on some of the archaeological digs and finds that she had. Now, the Kurgan hypothesis is her major contribution. That was already in 1951, and it's assumed by others that in terms of Indo-European studies, that was a very important thing. She did it primarily at that time because she had no other tools on linguistic analysis, together with some of the archaeological finds. But as Mykolo said in his paper in 2016, there were genetic studies to show that yes, that kind of migration did take place, which sort of justified in her hypothesis. So that's one aspect of her work, and I think there's agreement to that. Her goddess hypothesis in the trilogy of his book is not taken seriously by or most any archaeologist. And well, the well, I can in Bernard Weiler of the University of Pennsylvania, in an interview in the New York Times, commented that most of Gimbutas's peers believe her to be, quote, immensely knowledgeable, but not very good in critical analysis. She amasses all the data and then leaps from it to conclusions without any intervening argument. He said that most archaeologists consider her to be an eccentric. Now, I think the leap that they're talking about is that she makes these claims about a matriarchal society based on figurines of goddesses. And figurines of goddesses figure in a lot of civilization. Egyptian civilization has a lot of, in the tombs you find a lot of images of goddesses, but the Egyptian was not a matriarchal society. Greek civilization, Roman civilization were not matriarchal societies. And also some archaeologists says that if you have figurines of women, doesn't always mean it's for fertility or mother. For example, in Egyptian, when the goddess or woman holds her breast, it's a symbol of grief, not of fertility. Other archaeologists point out that in Lithuania, there were a lot of hill forts. So there was a lot of fighting among Lithuanian tribes that later Mindaugas united, but they were certainly not a matriarchal society. In the Neolithic period of hunters and gatherers, and that certainly is not a matriarchal society, and certainly in the Neolithic communities were small. There were no cities or villages that, you know, where women and men were equal. And he makes some quotes that I can't believe that Maria Gimbutas would say. He quotes that he says that she said the myth of she believed in the myth of continuous technological progress. Now, you would have to find me a quotation somewhere in Gimbutas where she would say that technological progress is a myth. You know, how did man get to the moon then? I don't know whether Mykolas or Gimbutas would say any of that. He also mentions in his paper the great maternal goddess. I looked through the index of at least one of her books, and I never saw any reference to a great maternal goddess. So maybe it's in a work that I haven't seen. The closest that I see mentioned, she mentions the great goddess of life and death, but no great maternal goddess that was a ruler of this utopic, romantic Shangri-La of a matriarchal society. Now, her work, as Violeta Kellertas says, did come in at the time when the feminist revolution was happening, and it was really picked up by the feminist movement, and for the right things, because it meshed with all their philosophy. And here, there could be an old example of that, of a utopia that once existed that then was destroyed. But unfortunately, there's no archaeological, really, or any kind of historical basis for those suppositions, and I think the figurines certainly don't tell that story. And so, and also she was become very popular with neo-paganism, because neo-paganism is, well, but they also pick up on Gimbutas and others. So I think what I'm trying to say is that if you are trying to present Maria Gimbutas's work and others seriously to a scholarly community of her contributions, then it has to be well balanced. I think I read the Wikipedia entry for Maria Gimbutas, which I think was probably expanded for her, centenary celebration. It's long, it's very good, has complete bibliography of her published works and a lot of footnotes. And there, I think they present a balanced picture, both of what her major contributions are and what the world community sees as that, and also the problematics with the goddess hypothesis. So I think that's what historians do. Mykolas is a philosopher, so he doesn't have that kind of background to put it. And the same way with a Vytautas. I mean, to understand the Vytautas work, you have to know a little bit about computer technology, the space industry, to see where his work, what his contribution is. And he mentions in his work that space flight would not be, that a Vytautas made space flight possible. Now, his Vytautas hypothesis came 9 years after the first manned space flight. So, I mean, that's something maybe that a philosopher would say, but no historian or historian of science would say, or describe people as stellar or something like that. That's not the language of historians and of scholars in field analyzing. So, Mykolas is a great friend of mine. And of Skirma, we met in the Boston-Cambridge area when we were both graduate students and were active in Šviesa. But also, historians need to know the facts. Maria Gimbutas never taught at Harvard. I know this because Skirma was her research assistant at Harvard in the archaeology department, but she never taught there. So, I mean, I just mentioned these things. It's okay for sort of these informal talks, but if there's any idea of publishing something like that, a historian or historian of science should really read that paper and review it very carefully before putting it out to the world. But and maybe I'll just say a few words about Indris and the network systems. And when she mentioned that those networks, I started thinking about my own career, and it certainly fit into your network thing, because as a youth, well, we came to the United States in 1952. I was 3 years old, so I grew up there. But initially, the Scouts were the major thing, and then we moved to a smaller town in Connecticut where they're not in the Lithuanian, so we didn't have a Lithuanian Saturday school. So my parents signed us up for Scouts, and we were active in Scouts in the Hartford and Worcester area. But then when I went to the university, like Judita, I said, I mean, and the language that we used was, the Scouts, and it was kitchen Lithuanian language, and there were no dance groups, or sports groups where I was, but at that time, and so I said, well, why should I be Lithuanian? And that's when Kavolis caught me. Kavolis was at Harvard. He wasn't at where I was, but he was at Harvard, so he knew. And Kęstutis Žygas, he was the one that sort of discovered me at Harvard. And Kęstutis Žygas was certainly one of the lecturers here at the VMU when it was formed, and he was the one that got me involved with both the Lithuanian Youth Organization, Lietuvių Studentų Sąjunga, and also with Santara Šviesa. And Santara Šviesa, the Boston, would often meet in Skirma's apartment, and that's where I met Skirma. And then later, Mykolas joined us, and because Santara, like for you, gave me, here were people discussing important intellectual things Lietuviškai, so that you can do serious intellectual work in Lithuanian. You could think in Lithuanian in these categories, and not only in the humanities, but Santara, there were also physicians there, engineers, and you can talk even about the physical natural sciences. And I gave talks on history of medicine there. So Santara, which is, I think, Santara and Ateitininkai, and Santara Šviesa has the same problem of translation as Ateitininkai to English, were the two sort of intellectual groups. And then also the network, then I got involved with the Lithuanian American community, the World Lithuanian community, and as I mentioned yesterday, the Joint Baltic American National Committee, and so forth. But anyway, but all these threads have these connections. And also your Franciscan father, he came to Connecticut in the town because his sister lived there. And we used to see him every summer and go to Waterford Beach together with, with him. So these Lithuanian threads, and that's, I think it's very important, because you have these kind of connection that you wouldn't have in living just in your own American community, because most of your American friends, who are your friends? Your family, your relatives, your colleagues at work, and your neighborhood and community for the most part, or some might be active in politics. But in Lithuanian, you have this broad array and choice of organizations and people of different ideologies, and I think that just enriches you in a sense. So engaging in sort of in the active work of the diaspora doesn't diminish you, and you just don't do it just for survival, but it sort of enriches you as a person. So I think that this symposium is sort of is a good illustration of that. The people who are speaking here, who are engaged in, that we're all a sort of a family of people of knowledge who share ideas, but from a particular cultural and historical perspective. And I think our historical perspective, especially now in this world with Ukraine, that even the Western world now says, well, the Baltics were right, you know, what they were saying about Russia. Now they say the Baltics were right. Not so much when we regained our independence, when the Gorby was still to be respected, and so anyway. So I'm probably going on too long, but I don't want to end the note on totally a black chronicler, but I think there's a lot of positive things here too. So thank you.
So thank you. Maybe our speakers would like to react to what was said by our people or participants of our discussion. And Indra, maybe you would like.
I partially, I think maybe can engage the audience right now. I think, yeah, Yeah, I think I'll open it up to the floor unless Anne has some links. I think the one thing that, I mean, this is maybe less response to the comments from our commentators, but I was interested to see also the links between women, right? That kind of also
it was very
spontaneously
interesting,
came out.
insightful. Yeah.
You know, none of us discussed, I mean, what we were going to discuss, but I was glad that you talked about your grandmother and the focus was on Maria Gimbuta. So another aspect of this larger university community is the contributions of women, both the stars and, you know, I kind of talked about, you know, more if we're going to have an image of a forest, you've got your trees, and I kind of looked at the mushroom growth at the bottom. But I think that women are an important part of the network, so that's just an observation.
And I just want to add, I liked your picture, the slide with the threads, that ball of threads. I would say that if some university is going to be established, we can sell this image as their logo, because networks, threads, connections is so important. So Daiva, if you would like to add, or I can go to the floor.
Kviečiam Gediminą Korublį.
Thank you very much for the panel. I will ask in English if it's okay. Before preparing this panel, we already had a discussion. And the question was, should we think about the Lithuanian university, which started in Kaunas, as uninterrupted or interrupted for nearly 50 years? So this is a question to everybody in the panel. I have my opinion, I may tell later. But, you know, if the light is carried, who carries the light? This is the question. And was it interrupted or not? You may feel implication I have, but I want to hear your opinions.
Thank you. Gediminai, do you have some reactions?
Did you? Sure. I will start. That's an interesting question. As my parents, my grandfather and my father, they were part of carrying the light. And they would argue that their light was not interrupted, but the place that the light started from clearly was. But they carried the light, and you know, there were times when it was really hard. If you read my grandfather's writings, his diaries and so on, it was really difficult. Of course, it was difficult to be in the United States knowing what was going on in Lithuania. And so when I think of, and it doesn't matter what I think, I'm only presenting my own internal elephant here. When I look at this, I see a university that it didn't physically exist, but I think it was carried on in the spirit of many in many parts of the world. Daiva and I have had a chance to talk to some of the descendants of Lithuanians that emigrated in the, you know, before the war, right after or during the war, after the war, and even more recently. And, you know, to your question of, you know, how does Lithuania connect back, or Lithuanian Americans, from my perspective, Lithuanian Americans connect back, my observation is that that light is really powerfully lit inside of them. The Lithuanian community and the spirit and the consciousness is surprisingly strong. And I say surprisingly because it has lasted so many generations. You know, that chart yesterday where it said, you know, over time the connection declines. And I would argue that it's really very strong. So back to your question of, was it interrupted? I think the place clearly was, my opinion, but the light itself was not.
I'll probably answer in a similar vein as Anne, but I think it's important what images we kind of use to imagine these things. And I guess I'm not imagining like there's some one beam of light that kind of, you know, has a very clear trajectory or something, a spirit of sorts that kind of is transferred. It really is, in my mind, it is a little bit like the mycelium, the gribiena, that was my last picture, right? Where you do have all these lines and interconnections and so on. And so what was started in 1922, right? That impulse and all the different connections that started. I guess my talk kind of indicated that yeah, these things came back in different ways. So there's interruptions, there's other influences. The Soviet era obviously, changed what was happening in Lithuania, but you do have, it's like mycelia, right? This life that comes back and forth in different ways. So yes, it's not an unchanged idea that moves forward in time, right? But people are influenced by, so the people who founded the university influence another generation and so on. So these things, these little bits of light kind of reverberate and come back. So there is a continuity of sorts, right? Institutionally, no, but you can trace all these different kinds of threads, right? That are institutional, family, friendships, all of those, and they all build up this institution as it is today.
Yeah, and I want to use the example of Juozas Miškauskas, who I had an opportunity to work with and meet because he was writing a history of medicine in Lithuania, but it was primarily a history of medicine of VMU. He brought with him to the West a lot of the documents about the medical faculty, and so he published his book and has been used as a major resource here. And now they've done some more work on the interwar period history of medicine. But so this whole medical tradition really was carried on in Chicago, and there was a very active physicians association there, former graduates in there. So there was like a mini VMU faculty still in existence, and while that, well, it still is. I mean, the association still goes on, and I've been invited to give talks at their conferences and so forth. So that light has never been extinguished, and the humanitarians and historians, as Ann and Indra said, is also so. I think to answer I think you said very well. The place was interrupted, but not the spirit, not the light.
I think I agree with all my colleagues in this, and let's skirmante, jeigu tu nori Mykolo drungų balsą atsakyti. I think that's a great question, and I think we all agree with the answer that in some ways, prispausta, occupied Lietuva brought us all together, and the light continued in the diaspora. For me, it seems Chicago, New York, Harvard, all offered big points of light that kept people like me and ponas KONDRATAS, who were born and raised in America, from becoming pure Americans. Mes dar vis liekom, sorry, tu gyvai Vokietijoje. I'm trying to keep you younger than you are. But if I could do a follow-up question, what I was trying to suggest earlier is, isn't the threat more to Lithuanian scholarship not the closed era that brought the darkness, but globalization? The fact that we even are sitting here speaking in English in one way is a huge victory, but it also makes me nervous. Isn't our biggest threat to us as Lithuanian scholars the openness now of the world?
I mean, I've lived in now here for over 10 years, and I really don't have that sense. In fact, I have the opposite sense that I think in the young people that I see in Lithuania, and the young scholars, the opportunity to travel abroad, to do the research work has opened their, and broadened their views and their Lithuanianness. And some even young scholars said, I became more Lithuanian when I went abroad and did work in the archives, and I realized how important our language, our culture, and supporting it is. And so that they come back here stronger Lithuanians rather than becoming somehow immersed in this sort of global world and become deculturalized or denationalized. And so I really don't have that fear.
I would just like to say something about Maria Gimbuten as a person, because both of the speakers presented a very personal point of view of the subjects that they were talking about. Mykolas wrote about Maria Gimbutienė as a scholar. I knew her quite well as a person, and I was best friends with her daughter Danute. I was often at their house when they lived still in Boston, and I worked for her as a research assistant at Harvard for one semester. So I think I can say that she's definitely a very, very well-respected scholar, an archaeologist. There's no doubt about that. But I do want to add a little bit different slant on her goddess theory than was presented in Mykolas's paper. It is a hypothesis. I mean, nobody ever said that it wasn't a hypothesis, because obviously you propose things and then you try to support it or not, or find evidence that denies it. And though it's only a hypothesis, but neither has anybody disproved it. So I just think that it was very important for the women's movement, and I know she was a very, very warm person. She was very supportive of many of the feminist branches of feminists that surrounded her. She was very supportive of her students who wanted to know more about that. And I must say, it wasn't, she didn't say it was just archaeological evidence that supported her theory. She said, I mean, she used folklore, she used stories, she used other areas, and as even in Mykolas's paper pointed out, she used her imagination. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, and it does promote scholarship to have way out there theories that then people can discuss and evaluate. So I just wanted to add a little bit. I mean, I read Mykolas's paper, but I really have a point of view of my own, and I really admire and respect the woman.
Thank you, Skirma.
May I, Egidijus Aleksandravičius, first of all, thank you so much for what you told us here. And my question, bit different angle to enlightenment in or intellectual processes in the diaspora after the Second World War, when Lithuania was really in the dark, and then that bright candle in the hands of American or world Lithuanian academicians and intellectuals. Some mid-50s, Kavolis wrote an article in Lithuanian, Lietuvio būdas ir likimas. We put that to the collection of his article, Nepriklausomųjų kelias. That time, being in Harvard, he wrote some diagnostic and prognostic about the character of the Lithuanians, especially in diaspora. And it was quite moderate or even skeptical about, saying that there we could feel some lack of Lithuanian individualism. That's why Lithuanians in the diaspora didn't achieve anything serious up to the moment he wrote. No serious businessmen, no bright, famous, world-famous names. Even the priests are just in the lower level of the Catholic hierarchy in the United States, all that stuff. And he insisted that we Lithuanians in the diaspora need to develop this individualism, creative power to conquer the world with our achievements. And herefrom, my question, isn't the fact that Lithuanian intellectuals or academicians, those sort of specific group of professionals, achieved the most, comparing with the other fields and activities, businesses or pop culture, or maybe Egidijus Balandis would say, no, the sports would be where Lithuanians achieved the most. But could you comment a little bit? Because no research in this field is done. Maybe those who had some mission, some duty to have this bright candle in the hands in this field of enlightenment achieved the most. It's a different angle. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a question of age, because the people who came over as DPs and intellectuals, most people, or that includes artists, writers, they got jobs in factories. And they could do only their work at home and in the evenings. And so and they wanted to be Lithuanian. I mean, like Dr. Girnius, he never had any other job. He was supported by his wife, and he did his work for Lithuanian Encyclopedia, all this idea and publishing. It was only my generation, the children of the DPs who had the good education, who could go out into the American society and have a ability to make a name or do something. So, but others, like in the fields of linguistics and everything else, you can certainly make a career. And I think Senn was just as famous in America as he is in Lithuania. So you can say he was a star. Why there were no businessmen? I mean, there probably were Lithuanian, because Lithuanians were pretty good in business in Chicago. And they had a lot of businesses in Chicago. But yes, yeah, the Viscus and others. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Kalbėjai angliškai, taip. I think the question raised on some level is the genesis of genius. And at some level, I think of a schema in the elevator in the Roosevelt Hotel. Would he have written Balta drobulė anywhere? Did it help that he was an elevator driver and not somebody who could lean back in Lietuva and be more comfortable? Where does genius flourish? You know, some people would say it requires a situation of closed offness, of conflict, of hardship makes genius flourish. On some level, if I understood your question correctly, among all other accomplishments by Lietuvai, business, science, weren't the brightest stars among the humanitarian intellectuals. And that's who you are talking to. And so, of course, we're going to say, yes, that's where our brightest stars were. But I honestly, not just jokingly, I agree with you. The kinds of things that we heard from even Jutas Mockūnas, an engineer, self-taught to be philosopher, and the Kirache. These are people that had such heart, even though they didn't work as academics. The suffering that they went through, I mean, may have helped them to articulate a kind of depth that would not have been possible otherwise.
Thank you. It seems like we have to finish our wonderful panel. And I would like to add to Indri's presentation. She also opened another phenomenon, how center was taken to the periphery. Vytautas Magnus University, it exists here, but also was taken to Kretinga, to Samogitinė area. That was also important, I think. And when we talk about light and darkness, and again, Judita says, only humans can take light to the darkness and make or take meaning of it. So now we witnessed this meaning of shadows and dark times, how it was taken to our days. And yesterday we heard that it was strength and fragility that goes together, and we can see those dualities might be taken only by humans. So thank you so much, every presenter, for your ideas, your experiences and narratives, stories.
I want to add to Daiva's speech also thank you for all our speakers for their sharing experience and their thoughts. And I would like to react to Judita's question about the challenge of globalization. I think that our talk showed that we have a nice experience, that we could survive occupation. We can preserve that light in a very dark times, really. And now we have people, we have experience, we have institutions, infrastructure like Vytautas Magnus University, like World Lithuanian New University, like symposiums. So we can invite these people, we can communicate, and I think we can become a laboratory or place where these genius can flourish and show up. So I think we are in the right place with the right people, and let's continue doing what we are doing. So thank you very much, and ačiū.